So I thought really today I'm just going to give you a bit of a guided tour of the NVT results out of 2014 and a summary of the long-term analysis, as well as a few other bits and pieces of commentary about the barley industry more generally that may be of interest to you. So first I was just going to start off with a few comments on the market. Now obviously we're enjoying pretty strong feed barley prices coming out of harvest and a pretty solid malting premium above that as well. A couple of global factors that have changed in the run-up into harvest that have influenced some of that. Now, our feed barley exports traditionally are dominated by Saudi Arabia and Japan and smaller amounts to other countries. We've seen the emergence of fairly large-scale feed barley demand in China, and Australian feed barley is actually working into the feed ration against US corn for a number of different reasons. So that's one driver of putting some strength into the market. There's also been some challenges for some of our traditional export competitors, particularly in North America. So for those of you that were at the canola plenary this morning, you will have seen some numbers on the growth in area sown to canola in Canada, and a lot of that has come at the expense of barley. So their sort of nominal exportable surplus is nothing like what it used to be as competition against our crop. The area sown to barley in the US has also been in free fall, so quite a lot of the exportable surplus increasingly from Canada will be drifting south of the border into the US. So Australian barley, for a number of reasons, has got some pretty strong fundamental demand drivers, and no one can predict prices, but we'd like to think that barley production is going to continue to be well sought. I guess one other observation out of the last 12 months, probably for every year for the last 20 years we've seen major growth in Chinese beer production, just massive. It's been the #1 beer producing nation for quite some time now. And last year we actually saw that level off. So whether that is a one-year blip or whether they have actually reached their market requirement, we'll need to wait and see. But I don't really see that as an issue, because the other thing that's happened is we continue to have really strong growth in beer production across Southeast Asia, and China's leading malting companies are increasingly exporting across those markets as well. So that tends to be more higher value, genuine Malt 1 accredited type varieties rather than off-grade or cheaper options. So good strength in terms of demand. Our thanks to Viterra for supplying figures on the commercial deliveries to the Viterra system. They've done this for a number of years, and so we're able to build up the picture of variety adoption trends within the state. And last week they gave us the 2014-15 figures. I guess the changes that we see are largely on trend for how we've expected varieties to be moving over the last couple of years. Most notable is this increase in scope. So it's been growing strongly, but out of last harvest represented almost a quarter of the barley deliveries into the Viterra system. So now really scope has gone past that phase of being introduced to the market. It now has really established segregation and marketing opportunities going forward into this harvest. Certainly you wouldn't expect to be discounted against nominal Malt 1 prices. So that's good news in terms of marketing and pricing for that variety that's now a big part of our production base. A lot of that has come at the expense of bull oak, as you'd expect. And so bull oak, by contrast, is down around 8% of production, and coming into this harvest we'll start to see some limitations appearing in terms of segregation delivery opportunities for that variety. It will still have strong market demand in terms of pricing, but the delivery options obviously are always limited, and I guess we'll see scope coming in at the expense of bull oak in some of those regions. Commentary on other varieties. Obviously Hindmarsh is a pretty well established big part of the state's production, and no major trend there. Similarly Commander, the other big part of our production base, not particularly changing over the last 3 years. Fleet has been a dominant variety, but in this last year we've started to see its area contract, potentially some of that going to scope. and probably quite a few fleet growers switching over to Fathom, which made its first entrance into commercial scale production last year. I guess the other general trend is the dwindling down of the old, out-of-date varieties and an almost trivial amount declared to others. So really most of the state is growing up-to-date, pretty new varieties. Okay, on to last year's NVT. Like we saw in commercial production, there was generally early sowing opportunities across the state with the exception of the southeast, and so the NVT trial series was sown on average a little bit earlier than long-term average, with most of the trials sown in the second and third week of May. We had really only one example of incomplete foliar fungicide protection, and that was Maritime at Minnipa that had netform net blotch infection up to the flag leaf at flowering time. But outside of that, you really don't need to be thinking about disease impacts when you're considering the yield and grain size results from 214 NVT. The grain yield averages across the state were remarkably similar to what we saw in 213. So an average of 3.68, a year before it was 3.7. But there were some marked regional differences. So Upper EP obviously had a much better year than the last couple, and the southeast at the other end of the spectrum. The trials themselves range from just under a tonne per hectare average at Lameroo in the Mallee up to 5.6 at Turretfield. Obviously we all know how dry things got towards the end of the year, and there was significant grain size pressure in a number of the trials. Not really evident in screenings levels per se. They were moderate. It was more shown up in retention values, with quite a number of varieties failing to meet the 70% retention limit for Malt 1. So there is some useful data in the NVT results discriminating varieties in terms of how they perform with that tight finish. And although there were trials, quite a number of trials with very high yield potential, where we'd expect the later maturing varieties to perform well, the sort of Oxford, Capstan type group, but given the nature of the season, even at those locations, they were not really competitive with the leading early to mid-season varieties. They were still the guns even at that higher yield potential. Okay, so onto a snapshot of the grain yield from last year. My mistake, obvious cut and paste job, it's not the 213 data. Within your paper there's a more complete table of variety performance. Just for clarity, I've picked out the popular varieties in commerce and some of the leading new contenders. And out of last year there actually were not too many surprises. The varieties have performed pretty well in line with what we'd seen the previous couple of years. Fleet, while a strong performer across most regions, is clearly outclassed by Compass, and pretty reasonable transition for growers to be looking at Fathom. One of the observations we had back from last year, at the beginning of the year, some areas had mouse problems and establishment issues, and we had described Fathom as having a very good weed competition, heavy tillering sort of characteristics. Some of that's a little hard to really fully measure in plots, but certainly the feedback was it filled the canopy a lot better than some of the other plant architectures and was very good in that role. And I guess that's part of the difference of Fathom from some of the other varieties in terms of its plant architecture and growth behaviour. Among the established malting food varieties, obviously the early finish to the year, Hindmarsh had another very strong performance across all regions. Commander pretty much in line with expectation, but along with Fleet significantly down in the Mallee compared to what its longer term expectation would be. The other number I'll draw your attention to is Scope. Now we know its yields are largely in line with Bull Oak, but if you look at these numbers, I guess Upper EP and the Mallee, where the IMI technology is particularly interesting, we're talking about 20% grain yield off the pace from the leading alternatives out of last year's numbers. And on these sort of yield levels and current pricing, you could be delivering Compass at feed scope at malt, and scope's going to be costing you $100 a hectare. So I guess out of that, I'd question whether we've got 25% of the state sown to it. Is that really the right way or most cost-effective way to deploy that technology? Can do the sums. Or alternatively, the other way to look at it is the new next generation IMI-tolerant varieties, which we expect could be on the market for $2.16 as a feed option, really does step into a good opportunity to replace scope. The other thing to bear in mind, with 25% of production, that's a lot of area sown to a CCN susceptible barley variety. So don't forget about CCN in the mix. Compass and Latrobe, I probably don't have to speak to very much. The yield numbers out of last year, spectacular increases over the established varieties. We've had just released the long-term meta-analysis from the stats team, and again, I've just pulled out some of the varieties. Not very different to the numbers that we saw out of the overall analysis for last year or indeed the year before. Fathom with a strong and consistent advantage over Fleet with the possible exception of the Mallee. Hindmarsh pretty strong in just about all environments. And I guess Latrobe, we've kind of used the language it's equivalent to or maybe slightly above Hindmarsh. When we go through this analysis, it really is pretty consistent, a 1% or maybe 2% advantage over Hindmarsh. So certainly no danger in going backwards with Latrobe. And of course, all of that data is available on the NVT website. That's a fairly sophisticated analysis, and I guess there's some interest in not necessarily just interrogating average values, but looking at behaviour of varieties across different site, season, location combinations. And in wheat, certainly there seem to be examples of where you can find particular adaptation of particular varieties. When I go through the barley data and just look at the top gun varieties, I don't really see many examples of that. It tends to be the fairly consistent, those average performances reflecting individual results, whether you look at very different environments or not. Just a quick look at some retention values from last year. We had a reminder of why Maritime's our long-term benchmark in terms of the best grain size and grain plumpness, but again, Compass, Schooner, Fathom, Bass really have consistently been up this end. Gardner, probably our bottom benchmark for what you can get away with even in better environments, and a few varieties that have actually managed to be below that. So some useful data to consider there. I'll just finish on a couple of comments on some contract varieties or specialist varieties. There are quite a few of these options now managed by different companies and agencies. None of these will compete with Latrobe or Compass for brute force yield or bulk commodity profitability. But with the right agronomy and given some price premiums, or more importantly, given what specs you can deliver Malt 1 barley against, these actually can be quite profitable options. But a couple of just headline comments for you to bear in mind. Considering Southern Star, timely harvest is absolutely essential to avoid sprouting risk. Admiral must be sown early or avoid any grain fill drought stress conditions. It's a very long season variety. Charger, yield competitive, but net form must be managed to make it work. Navigator has got some contract production hubs in the southeast and is a pretty handy plant type, but VS to leaf rust, so it needs to be controlled for that. So there's some interesting different options there, but they will need your expertise in terms of the right agronomy to get them over the line. And I'm right on time, so I'll hand over to Rob to move into wheat.